Okay, hello. I'm allowed to go. Excuse me. Is it good? Okay, go. So thank you everyone for joining today. So I'm Paul from Morpho, and today I'll be talking about decentralized lending. And so together we'll be exploring what's the current state of decentralized lending and what are the different paths forward in order to improve the state of the space. So the agenda is going to be the following. First, we'll be discussing a little bit about Morpho and the current state of Morpho. And then we're going to introduce what we call the two paths for DeFi, decentralized brokers versus protocols. And finally, we'll talk about the Metamorphosis DeFi lending needs. So about Morpho, very quickly. So Morpho is what we like to call the most efficient and liquid decentralized lending protocol on Ethereum. So it's called Morpho Optimizer for the current version. It provides the same liquidity as Aave or Compound, the same risk parameters, but with better rates. In total, we have something like $900 million deposited in the protocol at the moment, and we're the third largest on Ethereum. So the problem that we're going to tackle today is that Morpho Optimizer in its current form is very limited. And after a year building on top of Aave and Compound, because as you might have understood, we are a lending protocol, but we're also built on top of existing lending protocols. We realized that DeFi lending was really limited, and for three different reasons. The first reason is that you have limited efficiency. So, Morpho Optimizer's purpose is to improve the interest rates of Aave and Compound because they have large interest rate spreads between the lending API and the borrowing API. So you have a rate inefficiency. But you also have leverage like inefficiency. Like, for example, you can't take as much leverage as you can take on traditional finance. For us, there are too many trust assumptions. Like, we've seen countless hacks in the last 2-3 years. A good chunk of them were lending protocols due to smart contract risk, economic risk. We'll come back to that. And finally, for Morpho Optimizer, we just see too much cap growth. Like, lending is still, DeFi lending is still nothing compared to the trillions of dollars that are traded every day in the over-collateralized lending markets of traditional finance. And so we literally spent the last year thinking about what could be the next way for decentralized lending. And so one of the first things we realized is that there are literally two ways DeFi lending could go. You have the decentralized brokers path, and you have the protocols path. And this does not only apply to DeFi lending, it applies to DeFi as a whole. So decentralized brokers. So decentralized brokers are literally very similar to what you have in traditional finance, hedge funds, brokers, basically people that manage your money, except here it's decentralized. So you have an open infrastructure and you have decentralized governance. So the obvious examples of those are like the Maker of the world, the Aave of the Compound of the world are an open infrastructure. So they run on smart contracts. Everybody can actually audit what's happening. And changes in their protocol are transparent and decentralized. You could recognize those patterns through mainly two things. The first thing is they're smart contracts. So the smart contract of decentralized brokers is very product oriented. So what I mean by this is literally the code run by DeFi platforms such as Aave or Maker is quite similar to the one of a Web2 startup in some sense. So you have a ton of arbitrary choices in it, and you have a very vast code base. And the purpose is really to have as much features as you can and as much opinionation as you can in order to provide a very passive UX for the user. And the second pattern from which you can recognize decentralized brokers is reliance on statistics and economic model in general. So usually, not everything is done in the code. So if you look at Maker, not everything is done in the code. Like, you have the DAO that is handling all the risk management part. And risk management in DeFi is often, the part that is not handled in the code directly, but rather through the DAO. And so, there is this piece from Jesse Walden from 2019, which divides protocols into two categories. You have the incomplete platforms and the complete platforms. Complete platforms are more like the Uniswap kind of the world, where the code handles everything. And the incomplete platforms are the platforms where you were not successfully able to put everything in the code, so you let your DAO basically manage those parts. And This model is opposed to the protocols model. So we define protocols are really primitives, something that is independent of anything, not dependent on a DAO, not dependent on whatever external parties, and lays out a foundation for like future like abstraction layers to be built on top. And I think the best possible way to think of a DeFi protocol, but an actual protocol, is actually to make the parallel with internet protocols like HTTP, SMTP are actual protocols. They have like multiple properties that I'll be describing in a moment. But the first and most important one is being trustless. So you have literally no dependency on anything. Just like, okay, there is just the code that you have to trust and the Ethereum or the blockchain underlying that you have to trust. And otherwise, you don't have to trust anything. So usually it comes with immutability code and different patterns. The second part is being neutral or unopinionated. And basically it's about providing a... Oh, wow, is there an echo or something? Or is it just me? Okay. So basically it's about providing a layer that does not take any choice for the user, such that anyone is able to use the protocol, even though it's super primitive to use. So the good example of that is the IP protocol itself. Before IP protocol was actually a thing, so the networking layer, you had several different other protocols that were much more opinionated. You had NetBias, you had HappleTalk, etc. And what ended up being, the dominant primitive was actually the most primitive, the most unopinionated one, just because everyone could be connected to IP. And so we believe there is a certain category of DeFi platforms, and the greatest example of all in that category is probably Uniswap, where you have the least number of dependencies and the least amount of opinionation. And you could see that through Uniswap v1, Uniswap v2, Uniswap v3, Uniswap v4. Like Uniswap v4 is really about removing as much opinionation as possible, removing features, choice, like the smart contract in itself does not make any choice. So, okay, so if we apply this model to lending, well, let's talk first about decentralized brokers. So decentralized brokers, again, in the case of lending, would be the Aave, the Compound, the Euler of the world, where the risk management is handled by the DAO. And so what's really awesome about this model is that the DAO, in the case of Aave, there is a protocol with $5 billion into it, and the DAO is going to monitor the 500 risk parameters of the protocol. So the Aave protocol has more than 500 risk parameters, and every user of the Aave protocol has to subscribe to this model, but they don't have to care really about it. And so what's nice about it in some way is that all users are treated equal, so that gives access to huge amounts of liquidity. So with the decentralized broker model, you're able to fungibilize all the liquidity of all the users, such that borrowers can come in and borrow straight away, tens of millions with their capital. And the second really good thing about decentralized brokers is that they abstract all the complexities away. It's just that when you're using Aave, you don't have to care about, the liquidation threshold or the collateral factors and, all those kind of things are abstracted away for you because you trust the Aave DAO. You don't trust the code, you trust the Aave DAO as well to be able to make the changes on all those 500 risk parameters. So the problems in that model are obviously trust assumptions. So as I mentioned, you have to trust the DAO. And the way the DAO performs changes in those risk parameters is questionable. Every day, in 2023, on average, you have a proposal to update those parameters. And the thing is that the Aave DAO is not just proposing, it's validating proposition from third parties. And third parties that have calculated those parameters, so let's say I want to change the risk parameter of DAI from 75% to 80%. This is a proposal done by a third party which does not reveal how those calculations are made. So as a token holder, I'm not a risk expert. Like I don't have 3 PhDs in what risk management and everything, but I have to trust a third party in the proposition it does without knowing anything on how he came to that conclusion. So that's on the risk management part. Obviously, you have smart contracts. Unfortunately, we went through a bunch of hacks recently in lending. Like the most famous of those was obviously the Euler hack, which introduced, like a bug was introduced in the last upgrade. And even though it was audited and the rest of the code was audited multiple times, well, you know, a bug was still there, and mainly due to the fact that the code base was very large and very hard to audit at the same time. And the second point I want to mention is like how limited efficiency and scalability is in the decentralized broker model. So when you look at the Aave protocol or the Compound protocol or the Morpho protocol, as it is now, you have a bunch of assets in the same pool. So you get the idea that those parameters need to be updated. So this like operational costs that is factored in because there is a fee in the Aave protocol that you have to pay to actually pay those contributors that are going to basically update those parameters, etc. But it's not only this, it's just because you're mixing up all assets together, you have to consider the worst asset when you do your risk modeling. And so that turns out directly into, you know, poor rates, poor capital efficiency, and permission listing. You can't list as much assets as you want just because all the assets of the basket are tied together. And so that raises the question, what can we do? And after more than a year of thinking about it, and Morpho is the largest lending protocol built on top of a lending protocol, obviously. So we're the largest integrator of lending protocols in practice. We have more than $1 billion like on lending protocols. And at the same time, we built a lending protocol ourselves doing so. And really what we believe is truly needed is to first establish core primitives. So basically remove the need for the DAO to basically be trusted, because the DAO is just about validating third parties, and those third parties are completely trusted. And not only this is a trust assumption, but as I mentioned earlier, this is an efficiency bottleneck and a scalability bottleneck. And so the problem with this approach is that, well, if you become very primitive, it becomes very, very hard to use. Like, you know, we've seen extraordinary approaches like the Ajna protocol that, you know, is bringing, you know, Oracle-less lending, but, you know, it requires much more management from the user. Instead of, you know, putting back the risk management on the Gauntlet or the Chaos of the world or the Aave DAO, it's pushed back to the user. And so the user has to take on that complexity. And this is why we need something else, which is the abstraction layer. We need to rebuild the tooling, we need to rebuild the abstractions such that, as we were mentioning in the previous talk, and I think it was the purpose of one of the questions, is like, yes, some users are risk experts. Yes, some users are expert traders or expert LPs. And those guys will be able to sort of delegate their, users will be able to delegate their funds to those experts for them to sort of perform their operations instead of them. And this is how you get the most efficient and the most trustless and the most open financial service. And recently we announced that as Morpho, we decided to go that path. So even though the protocol was the biggest growth over the last year in the world DeFi space, we decided that that was not the correct approach. And we have been working over the last 6 months on our own protocol that is independent, obviously, from other lending protocols, but is also taking this exact right approach, like a primitive and abstractions on top that we'll rebuild in order to provide the same passive UX, but with the efficiency at its core. Cool. Do you have questions?
So everybody can hear me. These new positions that the users of your new protocol may open, will it be, I guess, like an analogy would be similar to how liquidity providers on Uni v3 would be able to specify unique positions? Is that what I'm kind of reading into what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. So yes, indeed, there is a strong parallel. It's obviously different because the primitives are different. On the side, we'll have, like, on one hand, you have DEXes, on the other, it's lending. But you could make a case for a parallel between Uniswap v2 and Uniswap v3, where basically on Uniswap v2, you come up with like a passive experience that is fully managed for you. And what's managing here is not a DAO, it's the formula, X, Y, equal K. While on Uniswap V3, you have to decide yourself what's your risk profile and you sort of like what's your sort of P&L strategy, etc. So yes, obviously we feel like complexity has to be pushed back to the user, the first layer of the user, in order for this to really be efficient at the core. And then we feel like we should rebuild abstractions such that the risk manager, like the Gauntlet, the Chaos, the Block Analytica, RiskDAO of the world, basically rebuilds what we today call like the Aave Vault, where it's fully managed for the users. But we feel like this is more layer 2 than a core primitive. And yeah, so to answer your question, that's going in that direction, definitely.
And will the positions be represented in NFTs, or will it just be a direct kind of protocol interaction?
Yeah, so the protocol is not public yet. We're aiming at releasing a white paper in the soon, not public date at the moment to share, and probably those details will be answered at this moment.
Awesome, very exciting.
Any other questions?
So will the new protocol be like an extension on the current one or just dependent new version?
Yeah, so it's completely independent in the sense that we're still doing lending. Like our code, like the Morpho team is laser focused on doing one thing and do it well, which is lending. And we've been doing that for the last 2 years. And even though Morpho Optimizer was a great success, so I don't know if you're familiar with the first protocol, but it's built on top of Aave and Compound. It's optimizing their interest rates. We feel like this is the decentralized broker approach. This is great, but has a capped growth, and we feel like the cap is around 10 billion approximately. And above that, you can't really grow further, while TradFi is doing like literally trillions every day. And so we're taking a different approach. This is a new protocol. Obviously, you'll have like potential links between the two, but those are meant to be like separate from a design perspective.
Me again. Will there be liquidations on the platform, or will the lenders just be left with bad debt?
Yeah, so let me think. So obviously, being able to provide this liquidation service that is guaranteeing lenders it's another level of passivity to do risk management that to auto-liquidate yourself in some sense. What I mean by this is that the game liquidators are playing is an even stronger game in sort of like reactivity than risk management in itself. And we feel like asking lenders straight away to take over that job and removing the need for liquidations is a bit maybe too early for the current DeFi persona. So yes, we've been working on liquidations.
Awesome. Last one, I promise.
Hello. Can Morpho Optimizer run on top of the new version of Morpho?
So what do you mean run on top? Is just like, can you rebuild it?
No, optimizing the new version of Morpho.
Oh, yeah. So again, let me think. I think it's going to be especially complicated to do so. And again, after building Morpho Optimizer for 2 years, I think it's going to be a great challenge. But like the concept of optimizer is like really tied to the fact that lending protocols are using an interest rate model rather than an actual, order book with exit liquidity on a DEX or something. So yeah, all this to say that there is always room for Morpho Optimizer in the world where you have interest rate models. It's just more or less easy to build and to automate at the smart contract level.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I had a question about Ajna because it sounded like you want to make the job of suppliers, in this case, more complex in exchange for potential capital efficiency. But you just mentioned that You're working on liquidation mechanism, so I would assume that you would use some oracles because that's the main difference for with Ajna, right? They're not using the oracles and letting the lenders trigger liquidations.
Yeah, so good question. My personal take on oracles is that they're extremely powerful. And to me, it's really hard to think of a protocol that does not have an oracle unless it is a DEX itself. Trading protocols are probably the only protocol that has the very notion of price embedded at their core. And when you look at Ajna, well, in their design, they're rebuilding your market. You know, it's not just a lending protocol, it's also a trading protocol, and it's written on the website, I think. And when you're looking at just doing lending and do it extremely well and as efficient as possible, I don't think that should be the job of the lending protocol to do. And when you look at like the new oracles implementation of Uniswap before, I think we can be very confident about decentralized oracles. Again, personal take, like, you know, oracle-less is also a thing, but I'm just think like the pain point is not sufficiently here to come up with a full implementation where the pain to solve is removing oracles. Any other question? I think we're out of time anyway, but oh.
Last.
Okay, last one.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah. So, how do you think about upgradability of internet protocols and like security? Like, 'cause I think this is one of the main advantage of having like someone who can have access to the smart contract, stop it, or put it in safe mode. Yeah. How do you think about that in Morpho?
Yeah, so when I was describing the two approaches, decentralized brokers versus protocols, one side, decentralized broker approach is really about traditional finance world, where you would have like time locks, pause systems, and you're basically managing the thing and making sure, you know, everything goes well, and you have like convenient options and features to be able to handle emergency events, etc., etc. On the protocol side of things, it should not even be a question of like, the protocol should be designed in such a way that there is no notion of management. Like, you don't manage HTTP. You can improve HTTP by doing HTTP 1.1, 1.2, etc. But you don't you don't upgrade the HTTP. Like, people have to upgrade their clients, basically. And so the way we're thinking about it is that immutability, like as soon as you have an upgradability pattern, is that you're thinking about your code base as not a protocol, but more of a decentralized broker or decentralized fund, where you're going to add features, you're going to have a large code base, and you're basically running a product, not a protocol, in the sense of like how I defined it before. Does that answer the question, or?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Let's say you have a hack, and like, for example, you can imagine how you can have a cooldown period, like to, let's say, we can only withdraw 100 million in, let's say, 10 minutes. And how do you make like when you have an internet protocol and you don't try to put cooldown periods or anything like that, because you don't know when you have a hack, you cannot have any access to the the smart contract, right?
But the thing is that the protocol never gets hacked. Uniswap never gets hacked. And when you're designing the protocol, you're thinking of it extremely differently. It's not about software engineering, it's about protocol engineering. It's very, very different, where basically it's made in such a way that it's impossible to hack. Like, there is strong invariance, not necessarily, but you could have strong invariance. You can have formal verification, like of the entire code base, in such a way that no hack is possible. And if the protocol gets hacked, there's nothing to do about it. You just drop the primitive, and it was just the wrong one. And so it would not, I don't know if that answers the question, but you know, you would not put cooldowns on Uniswap, for example, to withdraw liquidity, just because you know that the thing is perfect and it's like a protocol. Again, in the definition that we have, like, we can have different definitions, but yeah. And so yeah, I think it's just a way of thinking when you design a protocol. It has to be in such a way that it's literally not hackable, and there is no notion of like reserve or no notion of like common funds of everybody. These kind of things.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks.